psychic spies. This scientist has been paid by the US government to investigate telepathy. Just one of the weird ideas that science can't quite write off. And 100 years after H.G. Wells first dreamt him up, could modern technology achieve the impossible?
The Invisible Man. It's one of science fiction's oldest stories, and most people would have thought that it would stay that way. Filed under impossible, right next to anti-gravity beams, telepathy, and limitless energy. But around the world, scientists are reopening the files on these fantastic ideas. Could science fiction have been onto something after all? Welcome to the world of weird science.
Science fiction is a literature of weird science, of weird ideas, partly because science fiction is the literature of the 20th century, and the 20th century is a repository of almost every kind of weird idea that has ever been thought.
John Clute is the author of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction.
H.G. Wells in 1897 wrote a book called The Invisible Man, and although he knew it was nonsense, he knew it was a very powerful idea.
Wells's method of invisibility relied on magical serums. His science of the impossible was an instant hit with the public, in books and at the movies.
Much of visual science fiction is special effects driven, and invisibility is a quaint, cute, cheap idea for a filmmaker.
Invisibility was the key to Bela Lugosi's master plan for world domination. Flash Gordon used it for good, to fight off the evil empire.
I'll throw the transparency screen around us until we're ready to land.
What price would the military pay for a modern-day transparency screen? The stealth bomber is the closest we've got, invisible to enemy radar. But could a soldier be made to disappear? On the battlefield today, you're up against more than hostile eyes. It's lasers and infrared. Take a look at this infrared camouflage suit. It conceals body heat and is currently being tested by the British Army. It's the closest thing we have today to an invisible man. But how far are we from the real thing?
Invisibility is a fantasy to most people. But systems exist today that would make that invisibility a reality.
Mike Burns, physicist and military systems designer. Burns's Invisible Man will wear a suit of electrically conducting cloth covered with intelligent reflective sensors. By changing their angle and color, these sensors project the image of their background out in front of them.
Now, if you had a perfect image of that, then I would be perfectly blended in with that background, and you would not see me. If it's not a perfect image, you see something that's slightly distorted. It looks like it's something like the background, but there's something else in the way. I don't know if it's a shadow or a tree. If you're off at a distance, you can't tell.
It sounds fantastic, but the technology is already here.
There are enough sensors and devices around that would indicate that you can actually put them together and make the system happen.
Invisibility made real? The weird science files are shrinking. And could the same happen to another of science fiction's most enduring obsessions?
Science fiction is about power. Power is energy. The heart of science fiction is energy. Science fiction writers and readers from way, way, way back have always longed for an energy source which is free, infinite, and tied around your belt.
No 1930s B-movie was complete without its mad scientist in search of infinite energy. You simply couldn't take over the world without it.
There is power enough to seize or destroy the world. And only I know how to release and control it.
Today, the heirs to these eccentric geniuses no longer want to destroy the world, only to transform it. And the breakthrough could come from anywhere. Inventor Richard Hull believes there are huge amounts of energy trapped in one of the most abundant chemicals on the planet, H2O.
There is energy to be found in common water, which has remained untapped only because it hasn't been looked for.
Richard Hull is no mad scientist. He's one of a growing number of researchers who think there's more to water than we ever imagined.
When I was a boy, I could see all kinds of things in clouds. Today, when I look up there, I think, oh, there's 3 tons of water floating around there.
Peter Greneau helped to develop electrically powered guns for the U.S. military. One day, he started to wonder what would happen if a gun could be adapted to fire water instead of bullets. He teamed up with Richard Hull to find out.
1.
You get a short piece of lightning.
Water and electricity, the awesome force of a thunderstorm exploding from the barrel of a gun. A thimbleful of water, a high-voltage electric spark.
12 kilovolts.
Water explodes at 3,000 miles an hour.
And this seems to cut neat, clean holes in 1/4-inch aluminum plate.
Straight through.
But these water explosions were weirder than either of them could have ever imagined.
It appeared that there was more energy out of this explosion than was ever put into it.
There is a new kind of energy involved in there, which we didn't know about. Where does it come from? We don't believe in miracles. And the most obvious place to look for it is in the water itself.
It's long been a dream in science fiction to have this energy in limitless amounts. And many people have promised it, but as of yet, few have delivered it.
Have Hull and Greneau delivered? Science fiction has come true before, and when it has, it stood the world on its head.
As soon as the world of subatomic particles became available to the imagination, science fiction writers were a lot more accurate than aged scientists in the early years of the century about atomic power. H.G. Wells himself in 1913 described it quite accurately.
And we know now that the atom, that once we thought hard and impenetrable and indivisible and final and lifeless, is really a reservoir of immense energy.
20 years later, and Lord Ernest Rutherford, the scientist who discovered the atom, was still adamant that power from this tiny particle was pure fantasy.
Anyone who looked for a source of power in the transformation of atoms was talking moonshine.
Atomic power was as awesome as it was unexpected. Could water one day undergo the same transformation? Jim Griggs is an engineer from Georgia who's also stumbled across the weird science of water. He's invented a pump that turns cold water into steam, without heat. It started when he noticed a cold water pipe that was banging. When he touched it, he found to his surprise that it was hot.
You've heard pipes shake and beat and bang. That is a shock wave that's traveling from one end of the pipe back and forth. When that happens, there's a minute amount of energy given off in the form of heat.
So Jim started thinking how he might harness that energy.
What we have done with the hydrosonic pump is we've made a design so that instead of having one shock wave now, we're having millions of shock waves occur per second.
The hydrosonic pump spins water at incredible speeds. Shock waves rip the water apart, releasing enough energy to turn it into steam. No one is quite sure how, but it looks like water's playing tricks with the laws of physics again.
It appears that there's more energy coming from the hydrosonic pump than there is goes in.
Could Jim have made a mistake?
Well, when I first saw the results, I figured I just made an error in testing. Well, here we are 9 years later, and I haven't found my error yet.
Neither have NASA, who've started tests on Jim's invention.
The weird science files don't end there. How about anti-gravity? Weightlessness at the flick of a switch. It's an idea that dates back more than 100 years to the dawn of modern science fiction.
H.G. Wells' spaceship in The First Men in the Moon was powered by a magical substance called cavorite, a metal that shielded anything it surrounded from the Earth's gravity. It was an idea that caught on in the science fiction of the 20s and 30s.
Anti-gravity is a kind of flying carpet, a magic carpet. It allows us to float. It allows us to travel as fast as we wish. Gravity itself is something science fiction writers and readers have long dreamed to be free of. The gravity well of Earth is something terrifying. It's a prison.
And oh, how we longed to escape.
Right after the World War, and when people had seen that if you threw enough money at a problem, like the amount of money that was put into making an atom bomb, you can solve the problem. And so many people said, we're in the airplane business, and we really are in the anti-gravity business, because we lift people up in the air and put them down again. Maybe if we put enough money into research, we can make an anti-gravity machine.
In the 1950s, you'd be forgiven for thinking that anti-gravity was just around the corner. But gravity just wouldn't let go. Today, there are still people who refuse to give up hope.
We know that at some time in the future, it will be possible to control gravity. The real question is when.
Franklin Mead, Advanced Concepts Office, U.S. Air Force.
We're getting to the end of the line in conventional propulsion, and the Air Force is looking for new and revolutionary ways to get into and move around in space.
Dr. Mead's search for anti-gravity began when he unearthed an obscure set of experiments dating back to the 1950s. The inventor was one Thomas Townsend Brown. Brown claimed he'd made flying saucers float in an anti-gravity field, but his work was left unfinished.
Thomas Brown's work began with a pendulum with a capacitor at the bottom, and when this capacitor was charged up with high voltage, something on the order of 30,000 to 40,000 volts, it somehow got lighter. It either pushed against something or the mass decreased. Somehow you were getting a thrust that was lifting that capacitor up, which is what everybody would like in terms of an anti-gravity device.
Anti-gravity is one of the things that science fiction writers have always loved, and perhaps might not be so far from science fact. Of all the forces in nature, gravity is the one that's most familiar to people day to day, but it's the one that we understand the least. And in some theories of gravity, the gravity that we know turns out to have two bits to it. There's a big bit, which drags us to Earth, and a little bit on the top, which is like anti-gravity.
Could Brown have stumbled across a way of magnifying that naturally occurring anti-gravity? Top brass from the Navy paid him a visit, but their report dismissed his results as experimental anomalies. Frank Mead says they got it wrong.
I wasn't happy with what the Navy had done. There were some discrepancies there. They really didn't make that accurate a measurement. And underneath all of this, there still could have been an anti-gravity effect.
So Dr. Mead decided to reopen the files. He repeated Brown's experiments. Against all expectations, the flying saucers behaved as Brown had predicted. It appears that there may have been something in it after all. Anomaly or anti-gravity?
I'm not willing to just rule it out. There's still theoretical evidence that says that there might be a way of coupling electricity and magnetism with anti-gravity, and that's important. And Townsend Brown always believed that he had something.
Brown and his team may have celebrated prematurely, but if Mead's hunches are correct, we'd do well to keep the champagne on ice. Leningrad, 1959. Karl Nikolaev, the man the Russians claimed could turn on light bulbs with the sheer power of his mind. Sony headquarters, Tokyo, 1996. The site of the first laboratory in the world to try to develop the commercial potential of the dark recesses of the human brain.
Look into my eyes. Of all the weird ideas that science fiction has imagined, none is more intriguing than telepathy, the ability to read another person's mind. For years, no respectable scientist would give it a second thought. But at the height of the Cold War, the CIA got involved, and suddenly, ESP got serious.
Right now, ESP is still a mystery, but I'm confident that in the future we will know all of the answers.
Ed May, a nuclear physicist who spent 20 years with the American Secret Services, developing ESP for international espionage. His specialty? An alleged psychic technique called remote viewing.
And that's an ability of people who are able to sit in a chair like the one I'm sitting in, close their eyes, and accurately describe some event someplace else on the planet. The first such example ever occurred on the project in 1974, where our client, the Central Intelligence Agency, provided the geographical coordinates of a suspected nuclear test site in Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan.
What the psychic told them was enough to spark off 2 decades of research into remote viewing.
The subject drew a huge crane, and he said this crane is so large that a person standing next to the wheel would only come up to half a wheel height.
Satellite photos had already told the CIA the crane was there. They were intrigued. So they went on to ask the psychic, a policeman called Pat Price, what else he could see.
Pat produced notebooks, rather large notebooks full of data, and it's mixed. Some of it's right and some of it's wrong.
One of the things he could see was workers inside a building welding a giant sphere. It wasn't until 3 years later that the CIA found out that the sphere was real. Could remote viewing be the ultimate Cold War weapon?
Psychic spies.
Science fiction's take on telepathy was that as long as there was more to learn about the human mind, why shouldn't its heroes have paranormal powers? Psychic spies were as much a favorite with TV scriptwriters as with the CIA.
While the loss has been admitted to us, any wider publicity would be, well, internationally damaging, to put it mildly.
Look, are you listening to me?
Craig's in trouble.
You can't know that.
Maybe not. Call it a feeling, call it what you like. We've got to go to London.
Sometimes I find you people very bewildering.
Richard Wiseman, psychologist and skeptical researcher. A man who knows a thing or two about deception.
I find the idea of remote viewing fairly implausible. The idea that one person can psychically travel and look through the eyes of another person, as it were.
In the 1970s, scientists conducted a series of bizarre experiments in an attempt to prove ESP existed. Subjects tried to visualize photographs being viewed by another person in a separate room.
Marquees, nightclub marquees.
Several labs claimed they had positive results, but skeptics were always able to find flaws in the way the tests were done.
Nightclub marquees in Las Vegas.
I think that the evidence needs to be extremely good in this field if we're going to turn around and say, yep, psychic ability exists. And to date, I don't think the evidence has been that convincing.
But what about Ed May's work? He's been amassing evidence for remote viewing that makes even the skeptics think twice. In fact, when independent judges tried to match 26 years' worth of psychics' notes and drawings with the remote sites they were supposed to be viewing, the hit rate was slightly better than chance. In other words, it appears that May's psychics weren't just guessing.
Our data has been looked at, along with everybody else's in the world, by statisticians and psychologists, and the bottom line is they say there's something to it. The ESP is real.
Could Ed May have the first scientific evidence for ESP? How on earth could we see into the minds of people on the other side of the world? May believes there could be a clue in the electrical activity of the brain.
If you sit down in a quiet room and relax and close your eyes, your brain exhibits some sort of electrical characteristics, very much like a radio, and it vibrates, electrically speaking, 10 times a second, roughly. They have a name for that. It's called alpha rhythm. But that can be detected. It's been known since 1930. You cannot have your brain oscillating at 10 times a second, electrically speaking, and do anything else. If I say, oh, I'd like you to take a look at this photograph, guess what? Your brain stops oscillating.
Ed May sat one of his psychics in a quiet room, and in a separate sealed room, he set up a flashing light to come on completely at random. He asked the subject to press a button when she felt the light was flashing. At the same time, he monitored her alpha waves. As you might expect, there was no link between the flashing of the light and her pressing the button. But when May looked at her alpha waves, he found a small but significant connection. It was as if her brain was occasionally detecting what her eye couldn't see.
I'm led to an unescapable conclusion that we are dealing with, in the formal sense of the term, extrasensory perception. In other words, another sensory system.
But if even a weak form of ESP exists, why aren't more of us reading each other's minds?
Some people have argued that if psychic ability exists, it does appear to be a very small, unreliable effect, and therefore it's not very important. But the fact is, it still has got earth-shattering implications. It still suggests that, we can communicate with one another at a distance, that our mind might be able to interact with the physical world in ways in which we didn't sort of previously expect that it would be able to.
If you think this weird science will never go mainstream, it's worth knowing that here at the headquarters of Sony, the ESP laboratory is now 5 years old. And if history is anything to go by, once scientists find even a small effect, they'll learn how to amplify it. Could we one day have devices that help us read each other's minds? Instant and secret communication across the ether. One of our weirdest dreams come true.
Weird science. Ideas that some scientists believe will always remain in the realms of science fiction, and yet others hope will one day change our world. No one can predict what lies ahead, but if a century of progress has taught us anything, it's that our fantastic future will be weirder than we could ever imagine.